the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Destination Mecca by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Chapter 5. New Arabian Nights. 1,000 years ago and more, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid haunted the streets of imperial Baghdad nightly in disguise, seeking to know the true state of affairs among his people. Readers of the Arabian Nights will recall that in this way many plots against the throne were discovered, deserving subjects were eventually rewarded, and the disloyal were rightly chastised, as behoves a well-rounded story. One of the drawbacks that a traveller and adventurer suffers from when he also writes is that this sine qua non of persuasive fiction is often absent. You either arrive on the scene at the end of the last act, or blunder into something in the middle and probably get ulcers wondering what the end of the whole thing will be. Of all places, Cairo gives one that feeling of something either completed, like the Arabization of the country 10 centuries ago, or in the melting pot, like the Arab League, the westernization or the banishing of illiteracy. Cairo is supposed to be a sink of iniquity, a place of intrigue, plot and counterplot, headquarters of dope or white slave rings, 1,001 aspects of shady life and sin. It is easy to talk of these things, easier still to imagine dire deeds and frightful plots amid the medley of rich and poor, mosques and racecourses, palaces and nightclubs that are the impact upon a casual visitor. But where are these things to be found? The answer is that in 9 cases out of 10, even if you live in the city for 100 years, you will not find them. There is one exception to this rule. As with many another thing, like a strange trick of fate, you may stumble across something odder than a hashish smoker's dream when you are not looking for it. And this is just the reason that I found myself meeting the great assassin Harun, with 400 million souls as his potential subjects, and probably a pretty strong case of paranoia. If you do not believe a word of this story, nobody can blame you. All I can say is that every syllable of it is true, and leave it at that. I was dressed in my Arab robes, white headcloth bound with twin gold circlets, and a flowing black mishla in the old city, taking photographs of the oldest university in the world, Al-Azhar the Resplendent. After offering the customary 2 rak'ah obeisances in prayer within the immense carpeted mosque, I had risked a rapid snapshot of the entrance from within the precincts, and then wandered down the ancient market where the genuine brass bowls of Birmingham lay displayed beside cloth from Japan, rosaries of Mecca, or elephant-stamped incense of India. I have a weakness for Afghan sandals. Here, far from his native glens, I found a compatriot presiding over his leather stall, and sandals decorated with gold thread patterns, semi-precious stones, and even ivory. Now the Afghans, as any Middle Easterner will tell you, are clannish and a little boastful. Yielding to the impulse, I shouted out the name of the owner which was displayed like some precious text upon a gracefully written plaque above the open shelves. Aslam Khan, long live Afghanistan. May you never be poor. Invited into the shop, I drank innumerable cups of green leaf tea, and we talked of Kabul, of the mountains and the fruits, of the passes and ravines. He had been one of the supporters of Bacha Sakau, the brigand king of Afghanistan during the early 1930s. Forced to flee upon the bandits' downfall, he had settled in Cairo after making the Mecca pilgrimage. Since that time much had happened. Afghanistan was a settled, progressive state. He had made his peace with the government, and every 3 or 4 years would return home. but business here was good. Sometimes he yearned for the cool, crisp air, the green of the conifers, the clean, icy waters of the mountain torrents, but business was good in Egypt. As we talked, I told him of some of my wanderings, of my search for the unknown, of the wander bug in general. Then a customer came into the shop, and Aslam left me with his handwritten manuscript of Kusal Khan, poet hero of the borderland. I was immersed in the staccato rhythm of the Pushtu language when Aslam hurried back to me. "Do you know Persian well? I suppose you must. Mine is very bad because, as you know, I am a Khyber hillman. Come and help me with this customer, who seems to be a man of substance and doesn't know Arabic well." I went forward. The visitor was well over 6 feet tall, dressed in European clothes with a gold-headed stick, and carried a green rosary in his left hand. By his features I took him for a Kurd, and he spoke Persian like one too. "Peace upon you." "And upon you, and the blessings of Allah." "Are you the owner of this shop? I cannot make this man understand Persian, and I must have some shoes made." "No, I am just a visitor, but I expect that we can manage." He chose 7 pairs of shoes, a lead-loaded cane and a fly switch, before we relaxed and became more acquainted. Business being over, we left Aslam and went to an outdoor cafe for Turkish coffee. His name, he told me, was Emir Yaqub, and I had no doubt that, even if this were not his true name, he was certainly of the Kurdish nobility. Having coffee with this hawk-faced, authoritative and cultured man was like stepping back into the 13th century. His conversation was interesting and interlarded with pious phrases. Almost everything that he said had a flavour of power. I cannot be more explicit. Perhaps it was just what people call personality. He seemed to know Oxford well and spoke of the Turl and the Bod as one who had probably been an undergraduate there. But when he said a phrase in English, it was heavily accented. Not much could be gleaned from his talk about what his métier was. He knew Geneva, which might have pointed to the League of Nations or diplomatic service. Yet for one who seemed not a day over 40, he had covered a lot of ground. The Emir did not conceal his curiosity about me. "What languages do you speak? Did you take a degree? In which countries are your relatives domiciled? What do you think of the British, the Egyptians, the Arabs? Did you join the warriors of Islam in the anti-Jewish war? Is your interest in political and military things a hobby, or have you any training or experience?" I was feeling like a candidate for I know not what when the Emir rose and said, in very rapid Persian, slurring all the words into a blur that could hardly be understood, "Honour me, please, tomorrow night, if you have no prior engagement, for dinner at 8 at the Mina House Hotel." I bowed acceptance. "It is I who am honoured, O Emir." But he did not take his leave at once. We walked together into the street as the call to the afternoon prayer was ringing through the heat haze, and he led me towards a small mosque, sandwiched between a bakery and a school. As we entered, he whispered, ostensibly occupied with untying his shoelace, "I consign you to God's keeping. Goodbye. He will follow me. Go your own way." It was only then that I noticed that a little, dirty, tarbooshed figure who had been standing outside the shoemaker's shop was taking off his shoes beside us. I drove out towards the pyramids to keep the appointment, little clearer in my mind as to the real identity of the Emir that I had been before. Nobody that I knew had heard of a Kurdish chief of that name. From my window I had watched for the surveillance that apparently haunted Yaqub, but it was not being extended to me, it seemed. As I entered the lush foyer of the Mina house, a page asked my name, and he handed me a note. "Please take car registration number MSR 57854 from the hotel and drive towards Pyramids. Ignition key in lock. Y." I had been working very hard writing up notes and developing films. With no fixed plans for my next point of travel, I was in a sufficiently fluid frame of mind to follow this thing to the end, even if it was a joke, a trap, or the offer of a job. I was not even thinking deeply about the possible implications. Most people, I believe, at one time or another, find themselves in a frame of mind in which they are not disposed to think. What they want is action. So they go out anywhere, perhaps to a dance. Situated as I was, I looked around for signs of possible interest, saw none, tipped the Nubian boy, went outside, had got into the Buick convertible with the number plate which the Emir Yaqub had left for me. As I started it up, the thinking process seemed suddenly to switch on. What was going on? How did he know that I could drive? And I had no Egyptian driving license. He may only want me to cat's paw this car for him, so that his gang can steal it. The pyramids are no distance from Mina House, just outside Cairo. In about 3 minutes I saw the commanding figure of the Emir at the roadside, dressed in a Palm Beach suit with a fez and walking stick just in front of me. "Salams, Emir. Where are we going?" "Forgive the inconvenience. I had some business to attend to. Go home, Anwar." A small boy, looking like any ordinary Egyptian peasant urchin, and cheekily grinning astride a small donkey, placed his hand on his heart in salutation, kicked the animal's sides, and trotted off. I had not even noticed him until that moment. I thought I might be told a bit more than this. "I am hungry, and we cannot eat pyramids, O Kurdish Emir." Yaqub was all smiles now. I had not seen him like this at our first meeting. "Come along, you Afghan wild man, and see if you can sate yourself on what I've got for you." He got into the driver's seat, haired back to Cairo, and headed for Heliopolis. This was real cloak and dagger stuff. Yaqub offered me a cigarette from a gold case, flicked on the radio, indicated the lighter on the dashboard. I decided to use a more subtle approach. "Is there any way in which I can be of service to you? If you feel that, if I knew more—" He cut me short. "I am a friend of Abdullah Effendi, and he says that the melon seeds that you gave him have flourished in Damascus." Then I knew that I could trust him. Abdullah was a very old friend of our family. Emir Yaqub had added the last phrase in the immemorial way of the East to identify friends from foes. It was a random watchword, a reference to something that was known between Abdullah and myself, a trivial thing, yet it proved that Abdullah had told Yaqub somehow to identify himself. But I still did not know anything. Abdullah was a very old friend, a landowner in Syria, who spent most of his time, as far as I could remember, upon a book which he was said to have been writing for the past 20 years. Yaqub had checked up on me, and had contacted Abdullah, and obtained this code word all in a matter of 28 hours. That much I did know. The Buick ate up the kilometres, and we turned into a gravel driveway of one of those immense Pasha-built villas which almost overlook Heliopolis racetrack. We gave the car to a servant to garage and walked 100 yards to the next house, whose door was already being held open by a Nubian with a crimson robe and white sash. The events that followed may have taken some time to see, but they more than made up for it. We were shown into what seemed like a cupboard, whose door was then shut. After a couple of minutes in darkness, the back of the cupboard opened like a door, with the shelves and wallpaper on it, and we walked down a staircase, along a passage, then upstairs again, until I realized that we must be in yet another house. Another door opened. Now I was in the Arabian Nights. 2 black Sudanese with bared swords gripped me by the forearms. Deferentially, with heads bowed, They walked me along a corridor into an immense room. This seemed like a cross between a hall and a courtyard. I immediately recognized it, even if only from ancient miniatures, as a traditional throne room such as was used by the sultans of old, and this one was complete with sultan. Servants stood at regular intervals along the walls, one for each marble pillar. In the middle of the court there played a fountain with coloured water. The odour of incense filled the air. Sitting on a large velvet cushion at the far end of the hall was the Sultan. Ranged on either side of the fountain's oblong basin were those who could be recognized as courtiers and ministers. Yaqub came forward and freed me from the unwelcome attentions of the Negroes. Together we walked slowly to where the great man sat. As we advanced, he inclined his head. When we were within about 5 yards of the enthroned figure, who wore a Persian robe and jewelled red turban, Yaqub went down on one knee and placed a small, chased and jewelled dagger at the feet of the prince. It was the token of allegiance. The prince smiled and looked at me. I was not sure what to do, so I merely looked at him. On his green robe were delicate arabesque designs worked in golden thread. On the right breast was an ornamented version of the imperial cipher used by the former caliphs and the sultans of Turkey. If I had not known that this was the 20th century and that there was no commander of the faithful, I would have thought myself in the presence of the Caliph of all Islam, the shadow of God on earth, the peacock of the world, the... Yaqub was speaking in Persian. Commander of the faithful, shadow of Allah, leader, this is so-and-so, son of such and such, laird of such a place of the Fatimite family. He looked at me. Just in time, I remembered to say the traditional phrase which should end such an introduction. Aspiring to be a sacrifice for thy life if needed, come to do homage. May you live forever. By now the whole thing had me in its grip. I no longer thought anything was fantastic, even unusual. Now I know what an actor means by getting into the skin of the part. Everything was so contrived that, as far as anything was concerned, this was the Caliph of Islam, and I was here to salute him. Again, my thought processes were benumbed, and this time I did not even realize it. Now the Imam spoke. I adjure you in the name of Allah not to speak or write of this meeting for 6 months, not to divulge at any time the location of this place. He took hold of my clothes, which is the Arab and Muslim way of inflicting a compulsory oath upon anyone. I had nothing against that. Willingly, O Imam, leader. In Allah's name, then. He indicated a place next to him, and I sat down. Coffee was brought, and music started to play from an alcove behind the Imam. The whole scene came sharply into my mind again some time later, when I was received in very much the same manner by King Saud, the real traditionalist. The Imam had the fairish colouring of the Arab, and the stature of a Kurd or Afghan. He must have been about 50, or perhaps a little more. On his hand there was a large green stone set in gold, and a tiny green cord on his left breast showed that he was himself of the Fatimite family, the descendants of Muhammad the Prophet, in whose line the supreme political and religious command of all Islam is believed by many to be vested. He seemed a kindly man. Nothing at first betrayed any glimmering of fanaticism in those large, dark eyes. His ears were small and well-shaped, hands large, with long fingers that were beautifully kept. On his feet he wore a pair of jewelled slippers. And the story he told me was the most fantastic one that I had ever heard. I spent over 4 hours there on that occasion. We were regaled with fruits, sweetmeats, music, and eventually a gargantuan feast in real Oriental style. With his own hands he selected some of the choicest delicacies and pressed them upon me. When I left, he gave me a copy of the Quran, written in his own hand. But what he told me! The world of Islam was in ferment. There are various schools of thought about most matters. We have emerged from the period of Western domination into a state of near anarchy where nationalism is uppermost. The fate of the peoples of Islam, from Morocco to Java, was in the hands of politicians to a great extent, who were interested only in their own careers. To this I had to agree. I felt the same way myself. The world is divided now into two groups which are jockeying for power. They will clash unless there is any reason why this should not be so. History shows us that always when there have been two powers in the world, they have eventually clashed. There is, however, a third force, the force of Islam. This force can muster 400 million people. It has within itself the manpower, materials, and territory to be the greatest empire ever. All this I already knew, and I knew that many people running Muslim groups, whether in Arabia or Pakistan, Egypt or China, had the same idea. You agree with me. So do all other thinking Muslims. But how are we to achieve unity for our own good and for that of the world? I told the Imam that I thought that such a movement would have to come from the people, just as Islam itself had been a people's movement, and that it had been welded into the greatest empire ever, already in former times by people who worked for the cause, and not for themselves. Then came the denouement. Yes, but you have left out one important factor. In life, as has been acknowledged by many, and would be recognized by many more if they would face up to it, there must be an elite. By an elite, I mean that some people are more gifted than others. It is not a matter only of opportunity, that all men are not equal. This, too, I knew to be true. Well then, we must teach the people that Islam is founded on unity and equality as far as equality is possible. But there will always be leaders, and this is something that we must not forget. But we cannot unite Muslim countries by a stroke of the pen. We cannot compose differences by any other means than example and force, the twin bases of human life and particularly of law. In order to attain that power and to set that example effectively, we must bring achievements actually to bear on the people most concerned. This can be done only through the machinery of government. It is not practicable to initiate this movement through the usual channels of parliamentary democracy because the rot has set in too far. We all know that parliamentary democracy is a makeshift process and that it is of limited use. It has its function, but it is not a panacea for all ills. Therefore we, who are the elite, we who have worked for many years, we are to take the initiative. His eyes were really blazing now, and I felt in his every word a power such as few men have the ability to project. We shall take power in one of the Muslim countries. This we will do by force, though it will not involve much bloodshed. There will be a sort of coup. We have trained men to take over important posts, whether administrative or technical or even military. We will capture at one blow the people who matter in that country, and the rest will fall into shape. Even if we are wrong, which is unlikely, we cannot be worse than those already in power. Then we will streamline and Islamize everything. We will go back to the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet. We will make ourselves strong, respected, and loved. In this way we will fear nobody, and none will attack us, for we will be a threat to none. We shall be a benevolent dictatorship, with the elite always in the background. People are like children, and they have to be guided, and this secret power behind the throne will continue throughout the ages. People in other countries will emulate us. When we have set up our model state, others will follow. If they do not, then we can extend to another. Every revolution will have the appearance of a national one, so that there will be no intervention by outside powers. I really was most intrigued. Whether this man was a paranoiac did not seem to matter. At least he was honest. I could not doubt that for a moment. Naturally, the first thing that comes to mind is that, however good a government would there be no possibility of abuse of power, intrigue, and so forth? I ask this question. My friend, you have spoken well. Yes, there are these dangers, and 1,000 others as well. But the thing has gone too far for mere palliatives. We must take the risk. I am prepared to answer to God, and all of us should be so prepared. For the rest of what he told me, I must wait until the time limit expires, for he imposed upon me a further period of silence covering the more immediate intentions of the movement. But I am convinced that this man and his followers will exert a powerful effect upon the entire life of the Middle East, and even beyond. During this meeting and the 2 subsequent ones at which the Imam received me, he said several times, I am making amends for Hassan, son of Saba of our clan. This was one of the clues to the identity of the man. For many centuries ago, in Persia there arose an imam who promised his followers paradise if they died in his service. He was known as the Great Assassin, and it is from the name of these people that the English word itself is derived. See any etymological dictionary. Hassan, son of Sabah, became the leader of a group called the Ismailis, dedicated himself to the aim of becoming master of the world, and settled in the impregnable castle of Alamut. The story is familiar to Easterners, but perhaps less well known in the West. Hassan himself had been the disciple of a man preaching very similar views to those of the Imam whom I was meeting. He had created a synthetic paradise in a luxuriant valley where his followers were taken, drugged, and allowed to awake. When they found themselves there, it seemed like nothing less than heaven. There were fountains and gardens, rich fruits and maidens to minister to their every want. Then, having been again drugged with hashish, the hashishin, assassins, were taken away and told that they would be able to re-enter paradise only upon death, and at that only if they died obeying the direct orders of Hassan, son of Sabah, of the family of Hashim the Fatimite. Their bid for world hegemony was frustrated only by one element which they had not taken into account: the frightful eruption of the all-conquering Mongols into the Middle East. Halaku the Destroyer wiped them out. But before this happened, more than half the thrones of Asia had been rocked by the mysterious assassinations of the Hashishin. The king of Bukhara was stabbed, Emperor Saladin attacked, even the Crusaders were harried by these fearless fanatics sent out by Hassan, the old man of the mountains, as he was called by some. This is what can happen with a plan of the kind revealed to me by the new and anonymous Imam. Both ideas came from the same root, probably certain mystical schools which flourished during that time. Strangely enough, Hassan was a schoolfellow of Omar Khayyam, the poet laureate of Persia. Those who can prove descent from Muhammad are said by many to be the heirs to the leadership of Islam, and though the Prophet himself stated that there was no nobility in blood so important as piety, yet tradition dies hard, and several dynasties with greater or lesser pretensions to descent from him have ruled ever since in localized areas. Among these families, too, are some which are not now possessed of any actual territorial power, such as Sultan Muhammad Shah, the Aga Khan. Then there are the de facto kings, like the Hashemites of Iraq and Jordan, and King Idris of Libya. But Arabia itself, my present goal, was ruled by Abdul Aziz, son of Saud, and it was under the patronage of the Wahhabis rather than the Hashemites that I was to revisit the kingdom of my forefathers. There is a saying that everything has a minimum time, often quoted as an Eastern excuse for inaction. Yet my Cairo sojourn proved to my satisfaction that, active or inactive, there was a further wait before the time when I could set off for the holy city of Islam. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.